Well, today we are continuing our sermon series in which we're looking at a Christian response to different disturbing realities in our world. We've looked at a lot of things now. We've looked at natural disasters and illness. We've also looked at the subject of mass shootings and acts of terror, and we've looked at racial tension and violence. So today you could argue that maybe this is less of a big deal as a natural disaster or an act of terror. But even though it's different, it's still important, and it's still a problem. And that is divisive politics. And you could increase that and say, just in general, a divisive culture that we live in. It used to be that during an election year, politics were kind of in the center stage of most headlines, but then you got a break, until the next election year. Now, that's not so much the case. Maybe it's just my perception, I don't know. But now it seems as though politics is front and center all the time. Every day there's something new. There's a different possible scandal, or he said, she said, and there's different ways of interpreting things, and we're not sure what to make of it. And not only that, but politics now finds its way into other areas of life as well. So if you watch a football game, there's politics. If you, unfortunately, go to church on Sunday now, there's politics. If you, at least today anyway, and if you are going to look at the news, just look at the news, you want to find out what's going on in the world, there's politics there. It's hard to get away from. It really is. And for some people, it can be depressing. It can be downright depressing. And so why is it this way? Why is it that it seems like things have gotten worse? Now, you could have some historians that could look at American history and could debate whether or not things are really worse than they've ever been. I seem to remember in history class some duels and things like that, so I don't know if it's the worst it's ever been, but it's definitely, we are more divisive than we have been in recent history, we would say. People are less likely to want to talk to each other, to want to work with each other, whereas in the past, maybe different political opponents would have a general assumption that they were both out for the good of the country, that they wanted to do what was best. Now, if somebody disagrees with another person, they are out to destroy the country. And they have bad intentions, not just bad policy or bad procedures. And this, bleeds out not just politics, but in general in our culture. There's a general assumption that if somebody else disagrees with you on a basic way of doing something, then they have bad intentions. And so then what happens is, what we see in politics happens in general in our culture, is that we not only attack a person's methods, but we attack the person themselves. And so we see this very almost venomous reaction. And so people are unwilling to work with one another. It's one of the reasons why oftentimes it's hard to get things done. It's hard to work across the aisle, so to speak. It's one of the reasons why it seems like there's always gridlock in a lot of areas in life. And, someone pointed out this happens not only in government, it can happen in church. It can happen in just about any arena of life where you can have people who disagree and then are unable to work together because they disagree. Some people say that this is worse than it's been. Again, we can debate that, but what we do know is that it's hard to even find out nowadays what is true and what isn't true. As we look at the news sources, oftentimes we don't know for sure if we really know the story. How do we know that we can trust what we're reading when we read a news story or hear one on TV? How do we know exactly what they're trying to communicate? Because we do know that there are some news sources that are biased. In fact, many news sources are biased towards one view or another, because the people who give the news are also human and they have their own opinions. And what we oftentimes see lately is that oftentimes opinion kind of mixes together with fact. And so you have a mixture of fact and opinion in one article, and sometimes it's hard to tell which is which. Or sometimes you might have an article where they're really trying to convince you of something rather than to just give you the facts. And so there's not always an easy way to know. But one way you can look is to look at the headlines. And what are the headlines trying to communicate? Because a lot of times headlines are trying to grab your attention. They want ratings, they want clicks. And so if a headline seems sensational, the more sensational the headline is, probably the more biased the author is. And they're trying to convince you of something, not just tell you something that happened. So I thought that, while on the day that I wrote this sermon was the day that the memo was released. I assume you all know what I'm talking about. The memo was declassified. And so I decided that I would go to some different news websites and see what the different main headlines were to kind of give an example of how this works. So I looked at CNN, Fox News, and BBC News Network, just to see how they compare in their headlines. And so here we have, first of all, Fox News says, bombshell doc says British spy's dossier, paid for by Clinton campaign, key to Trump snooping warrant. Okay? So you have their bombshell right there. That is an adjective, kind of very, you could say, pardon the pun, explosive adjective, that is meant to grab your attention, and right away it's communicating something. It's saying this memo is a big deal, right? This is exposing a bias within the intelligence community, which then discredits the investigation in the first place. So the bombshell, boom, grabs your attention, says this is a big deal. And so they're trying to, sway you towards a certain way. Now, I went to CNN then, and their main headline about it was, memo alleges FBI abused its power to obtain surveillance warrant of Trump aide. Intel community disputes this central claim. So you see what they're doing there is, you could say those are all facts, and that's true, but you can put certain facts together in a certain way to kind of draw people towards a certain conclusion. So those two headlines, obviously, each one is meant to take you to a different place. It's been said that depending on where you read your news, people can almost be on different planets. It leads you to a different place. So CNN wants you to lead you to the idea that, well, this memo might not be exactly what it says. It might not be as big of a thing as what people are making it out to be. So you have different conclusions being reached by different news sources. Now here's the BBC. Memo accuses FBI of abusing power. Well, that's boring. I mean, it's kind of interesting, right? But that's kind of boring. They just said what was happening, They didn't have any nice adjectives. They didn't have any saying what other people thought about it. They just said, here it is, here's the memo, and here's what it's saying. And that's it. So they're giving, now I don't know if BBC News Network is completely objective, but you can tell based on those headlines, okay, that third one seems to be a little bit more objective, maybe. And so, all that to say that where you get your news, if you like Fox News or you like CNN, that's fine, but just make sure that you're not looking at just one news source, but that you're looking at multiple news sources. And take what you read with a grain of salt, because it's probably coming from a particular slant or a particular side. And that's important to do. So, what happens, though, is part of the reason why we're so unwilling to work with those that disagree with us is that we create a bubble that we live in. It's so easy to do this, especially with social media. Now, I think social media is a great thing, but it also has helped contribute to this, because we can create this bubble where we surround ourselves only with people who think like we do, and news sources that confirm what we already know. And we can just surround ourselves, and we can have what's called confirmation bias, which that basically means, and we all tend to do this, every single one of us. Confirmation bias is the idea that if you hear something that falls in line with what you already believe, you are more apt to accept it as truth. But if you hear something that goes against what you already believe, you're more apt to consider it to be false. We form passageways in our brain all the time. And to form new connections, new pathways in our brain takes more energy. And so it's easier to confirm what we already know than to challenge what we already know. That's confirmation bias. And so we have these bubbles around us, and we're not interacting with people who disagree with us. So we're never challenging our minds. So what does the Bible have to say about all of this? Well, plenty, but let's look at Romans 12:3. It says, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, Rather, think of yourself with sober judgment. Well, whenever you think that you are right about everything you believe, you are thinking of yourself more highly than you ought. How many of you is that true for? It's true for me at times. If you ever are talking to somebody with whom you disagree and it never crosses your mind that you could be partially wrong and they could be partially right, you are thinking of yourself more highly than you ought. How many of you are guilty there? You don't have to raise your hand. Some of you are going ahead, but yeah, it's true for all of us sometimes. Thinking of yourself with sober judgment means having an attitude of humility and realizing that we're not experts in everything. And so it's hard for us to know enough to have we can have opinions on everything, but we got to realize they are that. They're just that. They're opinions. I have a lot of opinions on things I know nothing about. I have a lot of opinions on things that I know little about. And to realize that is important, because then I can listen to those who are experts in their fields, and that can inform me. What oftentimes happens today is we become convinced of our own opinions, and so we're not even willing to listen to experts in their field. We say, well, I just don't think that's right. And we have very little rationale for that. But, we need to learn to listen to other people and to realize that even people with whom we disagree, we could learn something from them. To have the idea and the attitude that I could learn something from anyone changes how I approach people. And it changes the attitude with which you speak to people. And so this is not easy, but we need to seek to, we ask the question, what is a Christian response to divisiveness in our culture? And one is to, first of all, don't engage in it. And I don't mean by that, don't engage in conversations or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is do not engage in divisive speech or actions, right? We can engage in conversation without becoming unnecessarily divisive. And so we can, in other words, we can lead by example. Just because people on TV or people around us are doing that doesn't make it the best thing for us as Christians to do. So refuse to get pulled into that game. Refuse to get pulled into that divisive actions or divisive speech. And that leads us to the second thing. Actively seek to build bridges. You always get a good visual of that anytime you go to Council Bluffs or Omaha. You have all these bridges being built, bridges being torn down. It's a long, long project, but it's a good visual for what we are to be doing. We are to be bridge builders between different people. This is what Jesus did in his ministry. He sought to connect people with one another who otherwise didn't associate. Samaritans, Romans, and all kinds of people that the Jews did not associate with. He tried to build bridges to them and to say, now there can be some things you can learn from them. These can be good people too. And so we need to be bridge builders. And one of the ways we do that is to seek to understand the person with whom we disagree. This is very similar to what I said last week with the issue of race. Seeking to understand where the other person is coming from. Even if you think in your mind that maybe they are over here and you're way over here as far as where you agree on something, to try to think about where they might be coming from. And so even if you think their ideas are way out there, okay, do your research, look into it, and find out, is there a way in which this makes sense? Maybe this idea makes sense if I assume this, this, and this, which I don't assume, but if I assume this, this, and this, that idea would make sense. If I had a different worldview than I have, would this idea make sense? And you've come to understand someone's argument if you can argue it for them. In other words, if you can make a case for what they believe to be true, even if you disagree with it, you understand them well. And so seek to understand, and then also realize that you can work with people you disagree with. You really can. It's not a prerequisite that you have to agree with someone about everything to work with them and do good things together. Ephesians 4:29 is a good scripture passage for us. It says, don't let any foul words come out of your mouth. Only say what is helpful when it is needed for building up the community. so that it benefits those who hear what you say. So what if everyone followed that philosophy? What if we followed that philosophy all the time? Not just some of the time. That would be great, wouldn't it? A lot of the times what we see is the philosophy is, I'll say whatever I need to say to prove that I'm right and to look good. And oftentimes that seems to be the view in politics, not always, but sometimes, and in life in general. But what if we took the philosophy of Ephesians 4:29? I'm not going to say anything unless it can somehow help build us up together as a community. You know, there's another verse that says, live as much as possible, live at peace with everyone. There's a key there, as much as possible. Sometimes it's impossible. But as much as possible means pretty much most of the time we can. You don't have to agree with someone on anything to be kind to them and to be polite with them. And so, what do? What is a Christian response to the divisive culture we live in? Assuming it's not going to heal right away, assuming this is going to go on for a while, we seek to, first of all, remember Romans 12:3, to think of ourselves with sober judgment, and then to seek to understand the other person well enough so that we can argue their case if we have to. And then to realize that we can work with people with whom we disagree. We don't have to figure everything out. We don't have to come to an agreement on everything, because we're not going to anyway. But to realize that we can still work together to do great things for the kingdom of God. And then may we, by doing so, we will seek the example of Christ, the philosophy of Ephesians 4:29, to build up the community with our speech and our actions to the glory of God. Amen.